Your reading for Assignment 9 comes from a book written by scholar Brenda Sarathy entitled Piñeros, Latino Labor and the Changing Face of Forestry in the Pacific Northwest. I chose this reading because it sheds light on a group of forest workers that we might not hear about otherwise, and also to give you more experience in reading a professional level academic book. In this short lecture, I'll summarize key points from chapters 1 through 3, and you'll read chapter 4 for your assignment. Last week we looked at the use of wood in World War II. Many trees were cut down during the war, and then a post-war building boom caused even more deforestation. But there wasn't a system in place to replant the forests, which was expensive, and there weren't enough financial resources available for reforestation in the 1950s and early 1960s. This changed with the 1971 Forest Practices Act in Oregon. Oregon had become the post-war national leader for timber production, so having a sustainable industry there was critical. And the 1971 Forest Practices Act set a new standard for sustainable forest management. The Forest Practices Act required reforestation within 2 years after logging on state, federal, and private lands. So now that reforestation was required, that gave a big stimulus to the reforestation industry, which then started to employ more and more people. First mostly Anglos and then more immigrants. Initially, in the late 60s and the 1970s, the reforestation work was not done mainly by immigrants. Here's Sarathy's description of the workforce. In the late 1960s and early 70s, most labor contractors were white male U.S. citizens. In this period, a variety of people made up tree planting crews, including a relatively small percentage of undocumented workers, Skid Row denizens, mostly male college-age students, and back-to-the-land hippies. So as college-age students, if you had lived back then, this is work that you could have been doing. The 1980s is when we see a huge influx of Latino workers and increasingly contractors in the reforestation industry. They came mainly from Mexico. Sarathy's whole book is a study of their work in Oregon, specifically around the Rogue Valley. Her goal is to draw attention to a group of people doing essential work, but in very remote locations where we often don't hear about them and know almost nothing about their working conditions. Interestingly, though most of the workers were undocumented, they did work for the federal government, and some people have criticized the government for failing to enforce immigration and labor laws while taking advantage of a vulnerable labor force. Tree planting is very hard work, and it has to be done by hand. Logging, meaning cutting trees down, can be at least somewhat mechanized, but when you plant a tree, you have to handle the roots carefully, dig the hole just so, and position the tree in exactly the right way. A machine can't do it. In the locations discussed in the book, planting often happens in the winter, so it can be cold and slippery. Slopes are steep, and the workers have to carry heavy loads of small trees to planting locations far away from roads. This photo shows the general location that Sarathy is reporting on, but in the summertime, just so that you can see how it looks. Besides its timber industry, it's also very important ecologically and obviously really beautiful. But you can imagine sort of working in this type of landscape in the winter, planting trees, and that's not so easy to do. So how did it come to be that Latino immigrants became the predominant workforce for replanting Oregon forests? Part of the reason is a general boom in the Latino population of Oregon in the 1980s. Between 1990 and 2010, the Latino population in Oregon grew almost 300%, and this included many people who were drawn to reforestation work. At this point, according to Sarathy, the federal government, and more specifically the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, is the single largest employer of undocumented workers in Southern Oregon. You also see pretty early on the rise of Latino contractors, who from the 1980s begin to take the place of Anglos as labor contractors for reforestation crews. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act gave permanent residence to many contractors if they had been in the U.S. prior to 1982. Interviews with forest workers, labor contractors, Forest Service officials, and Bureau of Labor and Industries inspectors indicate that Latinos make up the vast majority of the forest management workforce today. And oftentimes what would happen is that undocumented people would come in, to do the sort of heaviest ground level work and gradually work their way up. And once they got, more official papers to have a better legal status in the country, they would then become contractors. In the 1990s, things changed quite a bit in the Oregon forests. Environmentalists began to protest clear-cutting and speak out for protection of threatened species such as the famous spotted owl that you see in the picture here. 1991 saw a halt in logging in spotted owl habitat, and the 1994 Federal Northwest Forest Plan further reduced logging. With the Healthy Forests Initiative and National Fire Plan legislation under the George W. Bush administration, forest work in the Northwest moved away from logging and tree planting to fire prevention and other tasks to support ecosystem function. This was partly in response to severe wildfires at that time. And some Latino contractors who had gotten their start in the reforestation industry now switched over to the business of running fire crews to fight wildfires. So take home, decline in logging, leading to a decline in the need for reforestation, and then some members of this workforce sort of retraining themselves in different but related aspects of forest work. So Sarathy's take-home points: undocumented workers have performed essential services in America's national forests. These reforestation workers have received less attention than either loggers or immigrant farm workers. The work of these reforestation laborers is invisible because of remote locations, language barriers, and fear of deportation. Finally, the health of national forests depends on the contribution of these immigrants, and we should improve their working conditions. So all of that information comes directly from the early chapters of Sarathy's book, and I hope that it provides some good background for those who may not have done Assignment 9 yet, or if you have done Assignment 9, to kind of fill in some of the background for what you read in Chapter 4 of her book.